No, I didn't get that part right.
Let me Google it and then we'll find it.
Something about, I present myself in a form suitable to the relationship that I wish to have with you.
That makes sense.
Same sentiment, just a
Yeah.
little different wording.
Well, hopefully you got a chance to check out chapter 9, which is Know When Enough Is Enough. As you heard Randy just a second ago, I'm big into philosophy, and there's this law. I don't know if it has an eponym attached to it, but there's this idea that if you go on Wikipedia and you just choose any article you want, just pick any article, and you click the first link, because you know how like in the text of every article, subjects are like linked to one another. So like you can click on one link and it'll send you to another article. If you click the first link of any article you want, and then in that article click the first link, and then in that article click the first link, I think it's like a maximum of 7. I think it's 7 is like the most, before you always inevitably land on philosophy. And I think that's because
I'll go try this.
philosophy. Go for it. Go for it.
I'll
Here,
have to try that.
here, we could do it. Let's do it. I mean, we got the
Some of
time.
shooting stuff,
I got the Wi-Fi. Let's try it.
Diaper cream or something.
It's kind of like the 6 degrees of separation kind
Yeah.
of idea.
Yeah, I think it's 7. 7 or 8 is the maximum. Man, why is my browser taking
I
forever?
present myself to you in a form suitable to the relationship I wish to achieve with you.
Yeah.
Luigi Perandello.
Yeah.
Now, what's the 7 degrees of separation? I've heard that. That sounds familiar, but I don't know
It's
what
6
it is.
degrees.
It is 6.
6
Yeah.
It
degrees?
means you're only 6 people pretty much away from getting one thing to another thing. So like the experiment they did apparently was like somebody in Africa and a tribe or something. They're like, hey, we need you to get this package.
I got
to
some
a
morality
professor
in like 6.
in
6. Yeah. Okay, so
America. Harvard or
pick an
something.
article, any article.
And basically,
Like any
the only way
okay.
to get it there is by
338
giving it to
Lapua
somebody
Magnum.
they know.
Huh?
338 Lapua Magnum.
They can't just ship it. They
Is that
can't
point
Google it,
338?
look it up. They just,
And
hey,
338
Oh, there it is.
works.
this person's
Right.
going to the city. Can you
Okay.
take this to
First link is finish.
Okay.
And basically, within 6 people, they were able to get it from like a remote tribe in Africa.
And then
Really?
first link here, Nordic country.
It only takes
First link
6
here,
people.
cultural region. How far are we? 4, I think. 3 or 4.
No matter how remote.
Uh, Anthropology,
That's interesting.
human behavior, mentally, Aristotle, ancient Greek philosopher. There it is. Point is just simply that
It's crazy.
everything comes back to philosophy, right? And
You
so
gotta come up with a name for that or find it.
there's got to be a name. It's probably something like Godwin's law or something like that,
right,
you know.
right. Oh, that's funny.
And so I think this chapter is no exception. Everything comes back to philosophy. Like when considering the evidence, you know, what is the tipping point for arriving at a conclusion? You know, what is the tipping point for deciding that you have found the truth, that it is rational to believe, you know, in this claim. And so for criminology and you know, homicide detective, and you know, as a homicide detective, J. Warner Wallace talks about the escalating standard of proof, which in philosophy is known as epistemology. It's, you know, the study of knowledge. Like how can you know something? Like at what point is evidence sufficient for arriving at a conclusion? And so in the justice system, particularly in California, there's these escalating standards of proof. There's some credible evidence, which is actually, you know, admissible in court, like that holds rhetorical weight. There's a preponderance of the evidence, which is the next standard of proof used in most civil trials. It's a standard established if a proposition is more likely true than untrue. And really, in my experience, that seems to be the most commonly used threshold. Like if something is more likely true than not true, then it's considered trustworthy. And then there's clear and convincing evidence, which is an intermediate standard of proof. The standard is met when a proposition is significantly and substantially more likely true than untrue. So it's kind of like a super version of the last threshold. And then beyond reasonable doubt is the highest level of proof required by the law for criminal trials. But the important thing that J. Warner Wallace points out is that the word to highlight is reasonable doubt, because the next highest threshold, the next highest standard of proof is impossible to achieve. I'm kind of beating on a drum here. Like, we've gone over this repeatedly in Cold Case Christianity, that beyond any possible or conceivable doubt is just an impossible standard to
Because
achieve.
he had an alien twin.
Right. Well, and the thing with that is that we are limited human beings. We're fallible. We're limited in time and space, in perception, and that actually has implications on forensics and our ability to understand the past, right? And so when considering evidence in criminal trials, you will never have comprehensive evidence, meaning 100% absolute perfect evidence. And he gives this really elegant illustration of a jigsaw puzzle depicting Al Capone. Now, obviously, this puzzle is incomplete. It has no borders. There's missing pieces here and there. But you can see enough of this picture to arrive at the conclusion to a certain threshold of proof that this is indeed a picture of Capone. For example, it helps that his name is written in the picture, but even if, say, a few of the pieces were missing, like if the let's say the P here was missing, and you just had CA and then ONE, well, how many other names have CA unknown ONE? Like, maybe one other, if that. But the point is that you don't have to have every single last detail in order to arrive at a reasonable conclusion. Now, granted, of course, there are going to be possible explanations that aren't necessarily reasonable. Possible, sure, but not reasonable. And so the implication that this has for our faith is that we have looked at a body of evidence for the existence of God. You might remember a few chapters ago we looked at cumulative evidence for the existence of God, like the fine-tuning argument, or the origin of the universe. Here it is. So there's evidence from the origin of the universe. There's the existence of consciousness. There's the existence of free agency. There's objective morality, which is, I think, a very compelling one. The fine-tuning of the universe, which, in my opinion, is the most compelling evidence for the existence of God. But all of these go to support the evidence of God, but God's still hidden, right? So there are still pieces missing. There is such a thing as divine hiddenness, right? So for this chapter, at what point do you decide that this is enough, right? And the problem is that, as J. Warner Wallace gives, there's kind of this cute sort of pun that he gives about shunning the truth. And this word shun can be found in three different approaches to the truth. There's rational, there's emotional, and volitional. And so understanding how people approach the truth, whether they're making rational arguments or they're acting out of emotion, or volitional is actually, I think, kind of tied in with emotional, because volitional is more about just simply choosing to believe or not believe, right? And I think that volitional decision is oftentimes largely rooted in emotion. So why is this important? Well, there is this glaring problem known as evil, which admittedly is problematic for someone who believes in a God who is all good, all loving, all powerful. And so Epicurus challenges the existence of God with this idea that either God wants to abolish evil and he can't. So then he's powerless. He's not all powerful. Or maybe he doesn't want to. Well, if he doesn't want to, then he's not all good. If God can abolish evil and he really wants to do it, well then why do we see so much evil, right? It's important. The reason he brings up the shunning the truth is that when you encounter someone who is bringing up these challenges against God with regard to the problem of evil, it's important to first identify which of these shuns the person is dealing with. And I think the reason for that is that, let's say someone is really upset about natural evil. For example, Stephen Fry. I mean, if you've ever heard of Stephen Fry, he's a really prominent atheist celebrity. And in an interview, someone asked him, if you were to meet the Almighty, if you were to arrive in the presence of God right now, what would you say to him? And his response was, bone cancer in children? What's that all about? Which exposes his heart that he's angry, right? Like, that's a very emotional response. And so identifying that at the outset will go a long way for responding to those kinds of objections, because you can throw logic at it all you want. Like, there are great arguments for God, for the existence of God, and weighing the evidence, considering where's the tipping point between, does this evidence show God doesn't exist, or does this evidence show God does exist? None of that's going to matter if you're dealing with someone who is operating just purely on on emotions, or if they've just decided in their heart that they don't want to believe in God. However, if they are making a rational case, then this part does matter. This does apply, because if the only argument that someone is making for God's non-existence is the problem of evil, then it'd be like the question you should ask then is, well, if that is that all the background information you're considering? Because what about let me go back to that other slide. What about all of this stuff? I mean, sure, you could say the problem of evil makes it very unlikely or improbable that God exists. But if you take that in isolation, sure, I mean, you got an argument, I guess, but what about all this other stuff, right? So is that making sense? You might remember, Scott, from On Guard, when we talked about the problem of evil, how there are two versions of the problem of evil. There's the intellectual and there's the emotional. And so this is kind of what J. Warner Wallace is talking about with rational and emotional differences. And so the idea is not to proceed with intellectual arguments until you've identified whether the person you're talking to is making emotional objections versus logical objections. And only then would you proceed to decide if they're making objections on probability grounds versus logical grounds. And we can go into the logical version versus the probability version if you'd like, but really the tip for the call-out bag in Cold Case Christianity for this week's principle is identifying what kind of objections you're dealing with, right? Because I didn't realize that we actually do have these these illustrations. I was jumping way back to this other chapter when I had this illustration all along. Identifying the sufficiency of the arguments. If someone is challenging the truth of Christianity purely on this one evidence of the problem of evil, then sure, you might be like, well, yeah, I guess if that's all you're going to consider, but taken in consideration with all the other background information, all this other evidence, it's overwhelming. You know, the evidence overwhelms the problem of evil. Not to mention that if someone wants to complain about the presence of evil, they must first concede that there is an objective moral standard, right? So, like, if you're going to argue with someone, or if someone wants to argue with you, I should say, if someone wants to argue with you about the existence or the problem of evil, they have to first concede that there is an objective standard of good and evil, right and wrong. Otherwise, it's just merely a matter of opinion, and it's up to them to change their opinion, right? You just be like, well, I mean, if you don't want to admit that there is an objective good rooted in, say, God, then the solution is simple. Just change your opinion about the state of affairs. It's no longer a problem. It just evaporates, right?
It's interesting to me. I kind of have I think this chapter should have been divided into 2 chapters. It's like he's dealing with 2 different issues here. One is the when is enough, you know, which fits the stated chapter heading, but the other is the issue of where the objection lies, with the nature of the objections and your approach to that, which is different. So I think there's kind of like, should have been 2 chapters maybe in this one. But I think with what you're saying with the standard of evilness, I think that's a good argument as to, it kind of, offsets or counters the emotional response when you kind of bring them back to objectivity. When you bring them back to that standard and kind of explore the nature of that, I think that kind of softens or mitigates some of the emotional response.
Sure,
It takes it out of that realm a little bit.
Right, well, which is why it's so important to identify at the outset what kind of objections are being made. Because personally, I think that if someone is making objections to God on the basis of evil, like Stephen Fry, for example, you can throw logic and arguments and reasons and evidence at that, but you're just pouring water on a grease fire. It's just going to make it worse. They're going to get more upset, more angry, more emotional, and it's just going to further separate them, from arriving at any kind of truth conclusion.
I said to my brother-in-law when we were talking about a week ago, and I says, well, we were talking about evil, and I forget how I put it, but I used that example of it's not good to beat up children or something like that. And his response was, well, it's a common cultural thing that people have come to agree that that's not acceptable. And I didn't know where to go from there.
Well, so then a question would be, if everyone took a pill, if every single person took a pill that convinced us that it was acceptable morally to abuse children for fun, torture little children for fun, would that make it okay? Or would it still be wrong? If everyone agreed to do it, if we all just took this pill that changed our minds so that we all agree that it's okay, would that make it okay?
Okay.
Because if it is, then there is no such thing as objective moral truth. Then that's really the claim that he's making, is that they're all just socio-biological byproducts and that they're not objective. But the reality is that it is objectively true. There are things that are objectively wrong for everyone everywhere, no matter who you are. Torturing children for fun, should be an obvious one.
Mm-hmm.
So we've got like a 3-minute video with J. Warner Wallace recovering the chapter, and then if there are any questions or comments to discuss, I'll be thinking about those as we watch this.
I think
Now let me give you another important principle that is really, I think, for a lot of people.
Sorry, you were saying?
so it's the other side of that. If everything is social or culturally, okay, then that means, like John was saying, there's no objective or overarching something outside of us that actually tells us good or bad. So
Right.
if it is just purely subjective based off what we think is good or bad, then nothing is actually really good or bad. It's just whatever we want it to be.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not a world you want to live in.
Right, there's no basis for justice, because if it's all a matter of opinion, then I could just kill everyone in this room and face no consequences, because there's no authority that I am subject to that would hold me accountable for that. There's no basis for justice or law or, you know.
Then that dives into the logical inconsistency when people say, like, well, your truth is your truth, my truth is my truth.
Right.
They can't both be true.
Right.
Then you get into the nature of truth,
Mm-hmm.
and the meaning of actual truth.
Yeah, if you try to eliminate that, you try to get to what you're saying, where just whatever somebody thinks is, well, I'm free to do whatever I want, you can't judge me because you have no standard.
Mm-hmm.
Now you're just becoming animalistic,
Mhm.
easily, because you're eliminating humanity, or the idea of, oh, that's inhumane.
Right.
So, well, okay, we're not human anymore, now we're just,
Right. You've just thrown
we're Homo
human
sapiens.
value out the
We're now
window.
just a creature.
Mhm.
Because if you look at the animal kingdom, they don't care. They kill whatever they want to kill, and they do whatever they want,
Mhm.
just to survive.
Then we're
And nobody holds them accountable.
We're already seeing that in our culture. People, they threw God out the window in school and society, and now we're seeing where that's leading. And
But it's not. We're not that extreme. Like, they claim that that's their argument against it, but they would never institute that into a society.
Right. Right.
Because you still have to maintain a society.
Mhm.
we see it on issues that aren't as critical as, say, murder and whatnot, but other societal issues, we definitely see that.
Yeah, right. Yeah, in
Well-
other areas, yeah.
A good example right now is that guy that killed that executive, and people are starting to make him into a cult idol.
Yeah.
They're saying good thing. I mean, even I forget what her name stands for. They call her AOC, you know, and stuff like that. And there's other ones, and they're saying, well, it was murder's wrong, but people are outraged about getting their claims denied, and it's reaching a boiling point. And others are saying he's very attractive, and others are putting a GoFundMe together for him. My gosh, he murdered somebody, and we're turning him into, not everybody, but enough where it's in the paper, it's on the internet, where people are making him into a little bit of a cult hero.
Yeah, because they have no basis of good and evil, so they're trying to create it. Because, like, well, let's compare it.
Yeah.
Is this worse than this?
Yeah,
Which one's worse? So therefore, this one must be the good. So
Yeah. Just because both are bad doesn't
Yeah,
mean
right.
Yeah.
one is
Exactly.
good.
It is sad to see. It's a little sickening, yeah. Some of those people.
it's just though, like what Randy's saying, things that in the past would have just already have been acknowledged as being wrong. Some people are saying, well, maybe it's not so wrong.
So a great example of that, right, is slavery. A lot of people had slaves, and the thought process about slavery and owning a slave, a person a slave, was completely different 250 years ago,
Mm-hmm.
right? Our founding fathers had slaves. All kinds of people had them. Now, they're using today's right and wrong and judging them now, going, oh, they're horrible people, and we want to erase history, and we can't listen to anything they say. And it's like, that, for one, that's unfair. If you're saying that society changes and morals and morality changes based on society and culture, well, then there's nothing wrong according to the culture that they were in.
Very
So
good
then that's a
point.
double standard.
Right.
Excellent point.
Shall we go to the video?
Well, when do I know, Jim, that I've got enough good reason to believe something is true? When is enough evidence enough? This all comes down to the standard of proof, right? What is the standard by which we could say we really think we have enough reason to believe this has been proven? Well, the standard is different depending on the kind of trial you're involved in. If you're in child custody hearings, that's a very different standard of proof. I've actually listed 4 levels of standard in your participants guide that is the level we try to achieve in the most critical level, the level we reserve for the most critical trials, felony trials, murder trials, is the standard we call beyond a reasonable doubt. That's the highest standard we have. You'll notice in my list that I've given you in your participants guide that there is no standard called beyond a possible doubt. That is not a standard we hold in jury trials. As I said before, you can't get beyond a possible doubt. You really couldn't. I could always raise some crazy possible doubt. And that's why we don't have it as a standard in criminal trials. What that means is that there are going to be some questions in a criminal trial that I can't answer for you as the prosecutor's side or as the defense attorney's side. And I will typically pick juries and pick jurors by asking that question up front during the selection process. We'll say, hey, are you the kind of person who has to have every question answered before you can be certain that something is true? Well, yeah, I think I am that kind of person. I do think I need every question answered. Well, then you're excused. I can't put you on a jury because I will not be able to answer every question. I'm going to ask you to make a decision, even though you have less than complete information. Can you do that? Well, it turns out you've been doing that if you've been living on planet Earth. We always make decisions without all the facts at hand. We can't be all-knowing. So you have to be willing to make a decision, even though you may have some rather large questions unanswered, especially in jury trials. I had one case, for example, where I knew he had killed his wife, but we had no body. He got rid of the body. So I couldn't tell you how he killed her, when he killed her, where he killed her. I couldn't tell you how he moved her body, how he moved her car. I couldn't answer any of those questions for the jury. They still convicted him, and he even confessed later at sentencing. So I know he's the right guy, yet I could not answer some of the most critical questions. If you think you can't be a Christian unless you can answer every question, you're not thinking clearly on this issue, because you could never hold to any truth claim if that was your standard. Have a reasonable standard. Know when enough is enough. Now, I've got...
And he jumps into the next chapters. There's actually this really great illustration that I want to share with you from William James, where he talks about the will to believe. He imagines a choice that is forced upon you. Say you're on an alpine hiking expedition by yourself, and you see that there is a lethal mountain storm approaching. Like it is life-threatening. It's a really powerful storm. If you've ever been hiking in the mountains, you know what that's like. You don't want to be above tree line when there's storms coming. So you come to a fork in the path, and you don't know which side of the fork leads down to safety below tree line and which one just leads up to another summit. Suppose some other hiker comes along, passes you, and says, you want to take the left fork, that leads to tree line. And then he takes it and goes down. Now, would you just stand there immobilized saying, well, I don't really have enough evidence that that's true, so I don't really know if that's right or if he knew what he was talking about, so I'm just going to stand here and die on the mountainside rather than take the risk and go with where the evidence points. Clearly, the rational thing to do in such a circumstance is to go with the evidence that you have, even if it's uncertain. It's not perfectly certain, but it's more likely true than false, right? It would be folly to allow the lack of certainty to paralyze you and lead to your doom. And that's, of course, what's going to happen to the atheist if Christianity is true and the atheist just stands there refusing to make a decision, right? I think that's a really good analogy because you don't have complete information. I mean, you can never have complete information. That's why, the justice system recognizes that we are so limited as human beings. Like, we can never know everything. So,
in the words of the song Free Will from Rush, if you choose not to choose side, you still have made a choice.
Yeah, that's true.
Right?
Yeah.
When I think about the cases of, say, criminal cases in real life, where it's like, well, when is enough enough? To me, it's like, well, do you have to consider consequences? Like, okay,
Right.
if I'm just gonna say, hey, this is my baseline, enough is enough, and I'm gonna convict, like, compared to somebody who stole, shoplifted versus somebody who murdered. It's like, is there a difference in how
Yeah.
much is enough compared to each case?
That's a very good point. What's at stake?
Mhm.
What's at stake for whether or not life ends at the grave? Is there anything at stake? a lot at
lot.
stake. I mean, you're gambling with your life. You know, you're making a decision that will affect how you spend eternity. So that's a very good point. Is like, what is at stake?
Well, I think, I think an illustration of that is, you don't know exactly the best route to take to, say, a gathering.
Hmm.
Okay. One, that one will be faster than the other, maybe by 2 or 3 minutes. Okay. You don't have all the information. So what? You take one. It's of no consequence. So your standard of proof or convincing that one route is better than the other is pretty insignificant.
Sure, in cases where the stakes are low.
Yeah, right. Whereas like in a murder trial, you want to be pretty sure you
Right.
know before you try to convict somebody.
Right. There's no going back. The stakes are very
So
high.
I think that, one of the things with, atheism is there's a transition point where at one point you don't believe that there are consequences to this decision
Yeah, that's a good point.
because you don't think that there is a eternal life. Okay, so there is no consequence other than just how you operate. Do you go to church? Do you not? It's smaller life choices. But at some point, you realize, hopefully, that there is an eternal consequence to this decision. So, there's a transition point where the consequence of that decision changes. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it kind of goes back to, again, philosophy, Pascal's wager. Are you familiar with Pascal's wager? Is anybody not familiar with Pascal's wager?
It's either true or not true, and if it's true or if it's not true. I mean, that square, the 4, if God is real, but you don't believe, if God is real and you do believe,
Right.
if God is not real and you don't believe, and if God is not real and you do believe, what the consequences
Yeah.
are.
Yeah, so you have a lot more to lose
Mhm.
if you make the wrong choice versus if you're right and you make the right choice, you have so much more to gain. So it makes the choice obvious.
One thing too that I've thought about with this is it's kind of interesting how as an atheist looking at the choices, you're left with a certain set of evidences. But as you become a believer, there's a far greater set of proofs.
Yeah.
Just from experience and relational experiences that the atheist is not privy to. That's kind of an interesting thing to consider.
There's a bit of a clip from a video I'm looking for here. So relative to the full scope of the evidence, this is in regard to the probabilistic version of the problem of evil. Let me skip ahead to the part that I'm thinking of.
We looked at the logical version of the problem of suffering and evil. This argument attempts to show that since sometimes
Here we go.
what we experience makes no sense until we gain a wider perspective and see the big picture designed by the Creator. Here's the second point. Relative to the full scope of the evidence, God's existence may well be probable. You see, probabilities are always relative to background information. For example, if we consider only how much this man weighs, we would say it's highly improbable that he's a world-class athlete. But when we're willing to consider new information, that he's a professional sumo wrestler and a world champion, we quickly revise our view. In the same way, when the atheist claims that God's existence is improbable, we should ask, improbable relative to what background information? If we consider only the suffering in the world, then God's existence may very well appear to be improbable. But if we're willing to look at the full scope of background information, to take into account the powerful arguments for God's existence, we may come to a very different conclusion.
So that's exactly the point that J. Warner Wallace is making here. Like if you take this claim and the evidence of the problem of evil and suffering in the world purely in isolation, then sure, I mean, yeah, it might appear that it's improbable for God to exist, but when you take it in the full scope of all the other evidence, it should be easy to know when enough is enough, right?
But even the question of when is enough is purely subjective standard.
Sure. I mean, well, and that's
going to be different for every person.
right. Well, and that's why J. Warner Wallace points out this notion of shunning the truth, because at the end they're shunning the truth for emotional, subjective reasons or volitional, just decision making, like they just choose not to believe, despite all of the rational reasons that it's very compelling to arrive at the truth. And yet, like you say, it's there comes a point where you have to decide to accept the truth or just reject it purely on emotional grounds.
That's interesting. We're looking at it from like a Christian perspective,
Mm-hmm.
or someone who believes in God. That when's enough to believe there's a God. When we look at it from the other perspective, when is enough to believe there's not a God? And I can't think of very many things to put in that evidence camp.
Other than the problem of evil
Yeah.
or divine hiddenness. I mean, divine hiddenness is
If
challenging.
you're convinced of theistic evolution, or non-theistic evolution, naturalistic evolution, I think that's what is many atheists see as a proof that there is no God.
But there's really good arguments for that. So it's
Sure.
like
But I think they see that as you and I don't, but
yeah.
And I think a lot of unbelievers try to take a virtuous position of neutrality. And I think in those cases, they're not truly atheists, they're agnostic. They might claim to be atheists, but really it's agnosticism to just say, well, I don't know. And I think they try to hide behind the virtue of neutrality by claiming that they're not making a knowledge claim. But it's really hard to stay consistent within that position. Because at some point, you're going to make a truth claim, even though you're trying to remain neutral and not make a truth claim. So it's important to look out for that,
With the problem of evil, there is a response though, isn't there? I mean, even if you look at all the other preponderance, they're gonna say, well, you're ignoring the evil. We do have to address that, don't you think? I mean, isn't there a way to respond to that? How would you respond to that?
Yeah, so it's called a theodicy. Leibniz, Gottfried Leibniz, coined this term theodicy. It's an idea that it's actually a combination of Greek words theo and dicey, and it's an explanation for why God permits evil.
We looked at the law.
So theologians have tried to do this for centuries. Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz coined the term theodicy, and there are a whole host of approaches to theodicies. I think that it's it's better to take a more neutral stance than try to fully comprehensively explain the presence of evil and suffering in the world. But the logical version is conceptually bankrupt. So the logical version of the problem of evil says that an all-powerful, it's logically impossible for God to exist because, one, God can create any world he wants, which is not necessarily true. It's possible that that is not true, and that God prefers a world without evil, which I think that there is biblical evidence to support that God doesn't prefer a world without any evil whatsoever. C.S. Lewis has been quoted as saying that God whispers to us in pleasures, whispers to us in pleasures, speaks to us in...
Yells at us in our suffering or something like that.
Yeah, he uses suffering as a megaphone to rouse a deaf world. So suffering has a purpose. Granted, that doesn't necessarily cover what some would call gratuitous evil, or evil that has no apparent purpose. But then the next challenge would be, just because you don't know what the purpose could be doesn't mean that it has no purpose. And so a lot of Christians will appeal to the presence of evil and suffering as God's way of protecting us from greater evils and sufferings, or to bring about a greater good. Personally, I think that evil and suffering contributes value to our lives. And the Bible is full of cases like that, like James 1, consider it pure joy, dear brothers, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith will develop perseverance, bringing about a greater good, right? So evil and suffering seems to contribute value to our lives and our relationship with God. And like we saw in the video, we're not in a good position to know with any certainty that God doesn't have designs and purposes for the evil and suffering that we experience. So I would say that there is no such thing as gratuitous evil. And back to the epistemological standards of proof, beyond reasonable doubt, we are so finite and limited that we as humans simply cannot say with confidence that there is any such thing as gratuitous evil, because really all you're doing is you're admitting your own limitation. Like, I can't see a reason for this evil and suffering, so therefore there must be none. Well, that's a very irresponsible thing to say, intellectually speaking, because just because you can't see a reason doesn't mean there is no reason, right? Does that make sense? I mean, we might not see the results of some evil that God permitted until centuries later, right? We might be long dead and gone before the greater good that God purposed through some case of suffering and evil until centuries later.
All right, just to be the devil's advocate,
Mhm,
because I have to talk with my brother-in-law a lot. Yesterday was the anniversary of Sandy Hook.
Mhm.
How could you think some good could come out of that? If you were to ask me that, what would I say?
Gun restriction. Depending on how you look at it.
Well, I was thinking about that as a possible.
What was that?
Gun restriction.
Uh-huh.
Red flag laws. Different restrictions and laws. Me, that's the first thing I think of.
I was thinking about gun restrictions.
They have the 3-day policy. That's pretty common. It's down in Colorado and also other states.
In cases like that, I would be careful not to try to cite specific values that resulted from it, because then you're going to be challenged with, were these children's lives worth this, gun reformation legislation? Like, is a human life worth, even just a single child, and there were, more than just, there were a lot, is that worth it? So I would caution you not to try to identify specific value outcomes from that.
Just say, I don't know.
Right. Unfortunately, the best thing to do would just be to appeal to mystery, which again is is hard because like that's not a good argument to just say, well, I don't know. It's not a very compelling argument. It's not good rhetoric. But I do think that it's better than trying to make value appeals to specific outcomes, because no amount of legislative outcome is worth the life of a single child, let alone dozens, so if I were in that situation, I would say, I don't know, but I trust God has some greater good behind it, and that there it's not without purpose. It is not senseless. It's not without some greater good or preventing some greater evil, if that makes sense.
I think I would come at it a little differently. I think some of your premises I would not be in complete agreement. There may not be a purpose in some of those. I think that some cases God just allows things to occur that are senseless. I guess you could say that perhaps those senseless cases somehow sensitize us to the tragedies in the world.
But wouldn't that still be a purpose?
Yeah, and that is.
It would be indirect,
Yeah,
but it would
yeah.
still be a purpose.
We would see how evil we are as humanity, see the need for a savior.
I don't think that there is truly such thing as any truly gratuitous evil. I think that every single case of evil and suffering has, whether direct or indirect, some purpose behind it. God has some greater good in mind, or prevention of some greater evil in mind, even if it's totally indirect, even if it's not, even if it doesn't emerge for thousands of years after the fact. I truly, with my heart of hearts, believe that there is no such thing as absolutely gratuitous, purposeless evil. There's always a reason. There's always a reason. I don't know what it is. I don't claim to know what it is, but I trust that God has, a purpose, a design, a greater good or prevention of a greater evil for permitting these things to happen.
I'm not certain of that, but I'll concede the point.
I think go back to what you were saying in your quote about C.S. Lewis of the shouting of the suffering is a shout by God. I think it may not be believers being persecuted that God's shouting about. It might just be evil occurring or suffering occurring. So in Sandy Hook, I don't think your job isn't to give that person an answer. Like, you would have to say, well, this is what I got out of it. Me looking at Sandy Hook, and I think the point is evil. It's like there is evil in this world, and that is a sign of it. So don't go around thinking that we live in this great
We
society.
looked at the
I'm sorry.
And then this stuff happens, and you look for humans to blame. It's like, well, yeah, you can blame humans all you want, but what's driving these people to do these evil things? So we have to get back to: is it a spiritual thing? Is it why would we focused on material items or laws and human behaviors of society instead of focusing on that person's, what would lead that person to do such an activity? Isn't our society the way it's structured? Probably influences it, but if they don't have any type of internal moral compass, if they're just a freelance doing what they think is right in their own heart, whatever evil makes them happy. And I think that's where people struggle to do, is to call evil for what evil is. They try to rationalize it and figure out what happened here. Where did we all fail? It's like, well, no, that's just evil in the world.
Right.
That's causing people to behave in evil, destructive manners. And if they don't believe in God, then it's like, okay, if you don't believe in God, then
What's the
Where's-
problem?
Where's this evil coming from?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, if you say the existence of evil, well, because evil is here, there is no God. Okay, then where's this
What-
evil coming from?
Right, right.
Why is it a human nature to do evil instead of good?
You know what you're making me think about? I don't know what you said that made me think about this, because I was listening to you, but it reminded me of years ago when I was with my sister, and she doesn't believe, and her daughter says, well, what if a murderer becomes a Christian?
Mhm.
And my sister said, well, he gets a free pass, you know? It's kind of like the Sandy Hook killer that we're just discussing. If he became a Christian, how we would be able to say to our non-Christian people that he is going to spend eternity with God, you know, after he's done such an atrocious, evil thing, you know. It
That
does seem
happened.
counterintuitive
Mm-hmm.
that
Mhm.
he would, I mean, I'm not sure, I don't know where he's at. Oh,
Right.
he killed himself, that's right, he killed himself.
Yeah.
But, you know, let's say he had repented in prison after 15 years.
That actually
and became
happened.
a Christian.
That happened. Have you heard of Jeffrey Dahmer?
Yeah,
He did unspeakable things,
yeah.
and he got saved right before he was murdered in prison. Am I gonna see Jeffrey Dahmer in heaven? I hope so. I sure hope so. I'd like to have a conversation with that guy.
Not a cup of coffee, though.
Here's that C.S. Lewis quote: "God whispers to us in pleasure, speaks in our consciousnesses, but shouts in our pains. It's his megaphone to rouse a deaf world." So, all that just to say that.
Could you read the thing I sent to you this morning about the reading Wikipedia page?
Was it in a text?
Yeah, text message.
Okay.
Because with that, I think we get in a state of complacency, and especially in America where we're so spoiled, we have no clue what suffering
That's true. That's true.
And I think these big shouts are just wake-up calls to say, hey, you're not as great as you think you are. You know, you still have growth, and you still need me. You know,
So like
it's
when
kinda
Job
calling out.
says, you know, I didn't know how good you were, in that chapters 42 or 43, when he's saying, now I've seen you, I closed my mouth. Would that be the greater good that came out of that, do you think? That he became aware of the greatness of God, or, I mean,
Yeah,
Yeah, I mean, if that's
helped
the
him to
goal,
see the
yeah.
perspective,
Yeah.
to see his place versus God.
because God never tells him why he allowed all that.
Oh, you're talking about this?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Me reading Hitler's Wikipedia page after I went back and passed and ruined his painting, get him rejected from art school, so I don't have to study his overrated, boring paintings in my art class. Just how, that just points out to me, just reminds me of what we're talking about, just our limited perspective.
Right.
I mean, here's somebody that just, yeah, I just hate this guy's painting. I'm gonna go back and change things. You know, and then it had repercussions.
That's a greater evil.
Yeah, yeah.
So the point there is that just because you can't see a purpose behind it
Yeah.
doesn't mean that there isn't one at all.
And that's one thing, and I don't know if we'll ever know.
Right.
We will never know God's purposes in certain areas of events. You know, we know his ultimate purpose, but
Right.
I think we can recognize the counter of God as the evil part.
Yeah.
So it's like, oh, well, what's the purpose of it? No, I don't know what the purpose is, but I'll tell you what the evil of it is. You know, now how do we address the evil? Because sitting there and pondering on what the purpose of Sandy Hook was isn't going to really get you.
Right. I mean, let's say you do come up with an answer to that. What is that going to? What's that going to solve? Is that going to bring anybody back? Is that going to justify the horror? You know, like what would answering the question solve, other than maybe to like, you know, give you some solace? But
Well, and it might assuage that particular example,
right,
but you're gonna have other examples.
right.
If it's in the heart, if it's in the emotion, you know, that evidence isn't going to convince.
And that would be an emotional one if you were to bring that up. It's basically emotional. You
Right,
can't respond
right.
to it.
Right. Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah, yeah. Like, is it actually bad, or is it bad because you just feel it's bad?
Right. Yeah, what's the basis?
And it gets back to, so many of our decisions are right here.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You know, if you step back and look at, oh, okay, I wasn't seeing the whole picture.
Kind of like that $5 bill we just saw, right?
Yeah. When you look at the, little individual pixels, nothing makes sense.
Why don't we watch the whole video? It might be better to just watch the whole thing, the probabilistic version. It's only like 5 minutes long. Turn the volume up.
Suffering and evil exist. It is logically impossible for God to exist. And we explained why even atheist philosophers admit that this argument fails. But wait, it may still be argued that while it's logically possible that God and suffering both exist, is far from likely. There's just so much pointless suffering, it seems improbable that God could have good reasons for permitting it. This is the probability version of the problem. Suffering provides empirical evidence that God's existence is not impossible, just highly unlikely. Is this a good argument? Consider 3 points. First, we are not in a position to say with any confidence that God probably lacks reasons for allowing the suffering in the world. The problem is that we're limited in space and time, and in intelligence and insight. God, on the other hand, sees every detail of history from beginning to end, and orders it through people's free decisions and actions. In order to achieve his purposes, God may have to allow a great deal of suffering along the way. Suffering which appears pointless within our limited scope of understanding may be seen to have been justly permitted by God within his wider framework. Sometimes what we experience makes no sense until we gain a wider perspective and see the big picture designed by the Creator. Here's the second point. Relative to the full scope of the evidence, God's existence may well be probable. You see, probabilities are always relative to background information. For example, if we consider only how much this man weighs, we would say it's highly improbable that he's a world-class athlete. But when we're willing to consider new information, that he's a professional sumo wrestler and a world champion, we quickly revise our view. In the same way, when the atheist claims that God's existence is improbable, we should ask, improbable relative to what background information? If we consider only the suffering in the world, then God's existence may very well appear to be improbable. But if we're willing to look at the full scope of background information, to take into account the powerful arguments for God's existence, we may come to a very different conclusion. The third point is, Christianity entails doctrines that increase the probability of the coexistence of God and suffering. Consider 4 of these. First, the chief purpose of life is not happiness. People often assume that if God exists, his role is to create a comfortable environment for his human pets. They think the ultimate goal of our lives on earth is happiness, and therefore, God is obligated to keep us happy. However, Christianity presents a radically different view, that the purpose of life is to know God. This alone brings true, lasting fulfillment. Suffering can bring about a deeper, more intimate knowledge of God, either on the part of the one who is suffering or those around him. The whole point of human history is that God, having given us free will, is drawing as many people as he can into his unending kingdom. Suffering is one of the ways God can draw people freely to himself. In fact, countries that have endured the most hardship often show the highest growth rates for Christianity.
God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our consciences, but shouts in our pains. It is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world.
Second, mankind is in a state of rebellion against God and his purpose. Terrible human evils are testimony to man's depravity, a consequence of his alienation from God. The Christian isn't surprised at moral evil in the world. On the contrary, he expects it. The third doctrine states that God's purpose is not restricted to this life, but spills over beyond the grave into eternal life. This world is just the beginning, the entryway to an unimaginable, never-ending life beyond death's door. Paul, who wrote much of the New Testament, underwent afflictions, hardships, calamities, beatings, imprisonments, hunger. Yet he wrote, "We do not lose heart, for this slight momentary affliction is preparing us for an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison. Because we look not to the things that are seen, but to the things that are unseen. For the things that are seen are transient, but the things that are unseen are eternal." Paul understood that life on earth, and whatever suffering it holds for each of us, is temporary. Our pain will not endure forever, but our lives with God will. Paul was not belittling the plight of those who suffer horribly in this life. Indeed, he was one of them. But he saw that those suffering will be overwhelmed forever by the ocean of joy that God will give to those who will freely receive it. And the fourth doctrine is this: the knowledge of God is an incomparable good. Knowing God is the ultimate fulfillment of human existence, an infinite good. Thus, the person who knows God, no matter how much he has suffered, can still say, "God is good to me." So, if Christianity is true, it's not at all improbable that suffering and evil should exist. In summary, for all these reasons, the probability version of the problem of evil is no more successful than the logical version. As a purely intellectual problem, then, the problem of evil does not disprove God's existence. But even if those intellectual arguments fail, the emotional problem of suffering and evil remains very powerful. If you have suffered deeply, or if you've watched someone you love go through intense pain, you may be thinking, so what if God exists? Why would I want to respond to him or worship him? I feel cold and empty and want nothing to do with him. You're not alone. God knows your name. He knows who you are and what you're going through. God promises to be with you through your suffering. He can give you the strength to endure. Jesus Christ also suffered. Although he was innocent, he was tortured and sentenced to death. His suffering had a purpose: to provide you and me with a life-giving connection to God. Not only does God exist, but he loves you. He seeks after you. He offers you hope. And in time, he will make all things new.
He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death, or mourning, or crying, or pain, for the old order of things has passed away.
I just wanted to share one thing or thought on that is when someone is dealing with suffering and pain, that larger perspective narrows to a very selfish and concentrated perspective. And I think we have to be sensitive to that.
Absolutely.
And recognize that that is where it is, and sometimes the only thing that can overcome that is prayer and God.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I don't know if you guys caught it, but in that video, they point out the purpose, the meaning of life. I mean, that's like the biggest thing, right? Everybody's like, what is the meaning of life? It's so simple to know and be in relationship with God. Like, I don't know, it's just that, like, whenever I get to that part of the video, it's just like, wow, man, it's so simple. Obviously, this is a huge topic, and I could talk about this for hours, but out of respect for everyone's time, we should close with prayer. But if you want to stick around and continue discussing this, you're absolutely welcome to. Would anybody like to close us in prayer?
Okay. Lord, thank you for allowing us to have this day and allow us to gather and study and learn and grow. And we pray, Lord, that you would just help us retain it and
Yes.
just help us in our walk with you and help us grow and Spirit work in our life. And just we pray.
Thanks, Randy.